Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. Today, we're gonna broadly cover the ideas of collectivism and individualism and how they relate, how they contrast, and some of our introductory thoughts on it. We both watched some similar material to kind of just get like a brief background and maybe what each other's thoughts are to some extent, and we're just going to discuss and go from there and kind of see where we end up. So this isn't going to be the most structured or formal episode. Not that we really do structured or formal episodes. And it's also not going to be super rigorous. We're not coming here with like planning to cite 5 different books that we both read about the ideas of collectivism versus individualism. But we watched a few lectures and we have a few thoughts that we wanted to share and we wanted to discuss and feel each other out about. So the first lecture we ended up watching is from a lecture series done by Wes Cecil. He's a philosophy professor, and it was vaguely about the ideas of individualism and collectivism and how that works in a society. Now, the reason we're starting with that is this is the lecture that sprung to mind that when I brought up this idea for an episode of individualism and collectivism, Matt sent me over this lecture and I watched it. And I thought it was really interesting for a few reasons. So one of which is kind of defining the argument of what the difference between individualism and collectivism is and what that conversation is about. So Cecil talks a lot about, okay, well, nobody really wants to be self-reliant, lives in the woods. That's not human nature. And then he starts talking about societies and the trade-offs you make in different relationships and things like that. Now, this struck me because I was expecting a lecture about collectivism and individualism as like philosophical ideas. And that's not what I think that debate is about. I think this is a separate debate kind of about what kinds of arrangements individuals want to enter, how they make trade-offs of liberty, which is a fascinating argument, but I don't really think that's what the core of collectivism and individualism is. So I guess maybe I'll come around to that because I know you're going to push me on then what is that conversation. But everything that Wes said, I pretty much agreed with. But I would consider myself a person who is an individualist and believes in individualism. But I thought every point he made was compatible with those beliefs because everything he's saying is, okay, well, you're an individual, but you don't want to be self-reliant. So you engage in certain relationships like if you're going to date somebody in a monogamous relationship, you're foregoing a bunch of freedom of being able to see any other woman, right? So you're limiting your freedom in this voluntary relationship, and you because you've made this relationship. And then this expands beyond that, like when you talk about family structures and things like this, you're giving up time to do other things, and you're putting value in your family. But these are all voluntary. And I guess what I would argue is just because you're doing something in a group doesn't mean it's not compatible with an individualist thinking. For example, the reason I would date a girl isn't because I'm like taking a stand for her and being like, yeah, I'm just doing this because that's what a good person would do. I'm doing that because I want to do it, right? I engage in these voluntary relationships because it's something I want to do and I benefit from. Even when you do things that are selfless, like helping somebody who's in need, you also do it because like, how could you live with yourself if you didn't help somebody who you could easily help out? Stuff like that. I think a lot of these things come back to the individual, even though you do it in a group, right? Or with another person. So that's kind of a point Ayn Rand makes, who I think we might talk more about later. But a lot of what she says is just because you're an individualist doesn't mean it doesn't mean you have to die alone on your deathbed with nobody there for you. You can still have these relationships because they're beneficial to you, just like they're beneficial to other people. That's why I go to the store, is because it's good for me and it's good for them. It's not because I feel a duty to be a patron at a store, right? So I guess that's some baseline thoughts, so we can see where you're at on that.
Okay, so I told you before we started recording that I wasn't sure I had much to say on this debate, on this topic. And that's because I'm not sure I go along with the individualist collectivist distinction. I'm not quite sure, and maybe you can persuade me to take the debate a bit more seriously, but I'm not really certain that it even is a debate, and I'm not certain that those propositions are mutually exclusive. as you say, an individual can, an individual can willingly interact with other individuals, and an individual can even willingly act within a group. You mentioned dating, or family. We could add friends. We could add if you have a job. There's a plane going up above me, so I apologize for the noise. Your job, your career, your coworkers, perhaps your boss, or people who work under you, your employees. You mentioned going to the store, so you interact with the cashier, or you interact with someone to point to where the ketchup is. So you can be an individualist and still retain group interactions, and even say group identity of some sort. And I would even go the opposite direction. You can be a collectivist, or you can be in a collective and still be a individual. So I just don't go along. It's not possible to say, in my view, that people are completely one or the other, because we're both. So I don't know. You can kind of go from there with the conversation.
Okay, so I'm actually really glad you said it that way too, because this is actually why I texted you when I was watching the lecture, and I was so frustrated by it. Because I feel like that lecture, he makes a bunch of points that are very valid about making trade-offs, and he somehow ties it into individualism and collectivism, which I think is completely incorrect, right? So I agree that if you define those terms in the way he does, then it's pretty meaningless, right? Everybody's an individualist and a collectivist sometimes. And he kind of paints individualists as being self-reliant and wanting to sit in a cave alone, which is completely stupid, because that's not what being an individualist is. So this is why I was like, yeah, everything he's saying, he's painting it like they're collectivist notions. They're individualist notions that are compatible with like actually thinking about an individualist worldview. So that's why I wanted to bring up these definitions that I pulled that kind of spell out the differences. And this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So collectivism, any of several types of social organization in which the individual is seen as being subordinate to a social collectivity, such as a state, a nation, a race, or a social class. Collectivism may be contrasted with individualism, in which the rights and interests of the individuals are emphasized. So really, when we're talking about the differences in actual individualism thought and collectivism thought, it's more of individualism is about the individual's rights triumphing the group's rights, and collectivism is about the group's rights being able to trump the individual's rights, right? So a lot of people who are individualists are for any kind of voluntary engagement because it's voluntary, right? The individualist, his rights trump the group rights because you can leave the group at any time, or you can join the group at any time. You can engage in certain contracts and not engage in others. So everything he is saying about relationships and these trade-offs with your families, they're all things that you consent to and you can walk away from as an individual. But when you start talking about nation states and things like that, that you're born into and can't really leave, and then you're saying, well, even though you can't leave this, or it'd be very difficult to, you have to make this trade-off for the group's sake, then you're making this, people will make collectivist assertions. So that they're essentially saying, yes, but this is better for the group, so you're going to make the trade-off anyways, whether you want to or not. That's a collectivist idea. So he doesn't really, I don't think he does a good job of noting these differences that are very important. I think he just strawmans individualism as, well, you just want to live in the middle of nowhere, and that's not natural. That's a stupid notion. And then he talks about voluntary association as if that's what collectivism is, when collectivism is really saying, here are times where groups' rights triumph individual rights. And that's what people are often discussing when they talk about things like the government and collectivism and stuff like that. So that's a whole new bottle of worms, but that's what the real debate is at. So what's your reaction to that?
Okay, so there's two parts to your argument. I guess I'll go one by one. So I think I'll spend a little time defending Professor Cecil's or the way he conceptualizes the argument, and then I'll tackle the argument you're putting forward involved in this debate. So I don't think. I think what Professor Cecil is trying to do in that lecture, he's almost making a historical point. He's saying during around the time of the Enlightenment is when philosophers and intellectuals started to almost have this debate, and they started to say, okay, I can have whatever religion I want, regardless of what country I'm in or what group I'm in. I can associate with whomever I want, regardless of what country I'm in, what group I'm in. I can write whatever I want, think whatever I want. And he's saying that it was a question of the individual versus the state. And so, given our lineage, given the historical trajectory human society has gone down, I think he's trying to make the point that we have erred more on the side of the individual's rights trump the rights of the group. I think he even goes so far as to say is basically the United States is like the epitome of this argument, that we are a country that values rights of the individual above any other country. And I think the professor would say that he is not necessarily even against those ideas, but he thinks we need to reevaluate based on a lot of modern issues. We need to reevaluate the Enlightenment tradition and the our inheritance from the Enlightenment tradition. Now, to your second point, I kind of see a little trap door that either of us could fall down, and I just want to briefly mention. I think, and I could be off here, but I think that perhaps I disagree with your definition of individualism, and you disagree with my definition of collectivism. So we can almost be talking past each other, and maybe we would want to try to smooth out those differences in definitions, or persuade the other about the differences in our definitions of those words. Because again, I don't see, even if we conceptualize this debate as you did, which is it's either the individual's rights trump the right. I'm stuttering. If we conceptualize the argument as either the individual's rights trump the rights of the group, or the group's rights trump the rights of the individual, I still don't agree with that conceptualization, and I still don't agree with that debate. Just because, as I said, we're all individualists and collectivists at the same time, and so a community, to be in a community, I think you even acknowledge this. To be part of a community does mean you're giving up a certain kind of freedom. Now, you might be willingly doing so, and that's fine. And we can have a discussion as to the difference between willingly and unwillingly giving up those freedoms. But I just don't. I'm having trouble even going along with that conceptualization of this debate, just because of the way I view human nature and the way I view human relations.
Okay, I think we can unpack that a bit. So to close the loop on your characterization of Cecil's argument, so I think what you were kind of pointing out is he's making the historic argument that the United States is more based on self-reliance than ever before. And he kind of talks about the dissolving of families and how people will move across the country away from their family, and that would kind of never happen before. And people lived with their parents, and that was a good thing. Stuff like that. And in some way, that is, I think that's individualist in the way that he defines it, which is really about self-reliance. I don't think that necessarily relates to the philosophical point about individualism, which is about whose rights are more important than others. And I apologize if you see my cat jumping on my desk to my right in the background. So I guess I don't have a ton particularly to say about that philosophical point he's making. I mean, that point he's making, just because it's more talking about self-reliance, and if people are have too few relationships, it's like, well, the individual can make up their mind on that, right? So if you think that's a bad societal trend, I might be willing to see that maybe people should have closer bonds with certain people in their lives and make bigger commitments. I just don't think that's related to the ideas of the trade-offs and rights that pertain to groups, right? Now, if we want to talk about, I guess, how we should define, as we discuss this, these philosophical points, how we want to define individualist and collectivist. The reason why I like those definitions from the Encyclopedia Britannica is because I think like a classic situation that pits group rights versus individual rights is just something about taxation, right? So you can imagine, okay, 50 people are in a room, they're in a group, they're in a small society. 35 vote for taxes, 15 vote against it. Those 15 don't want to pay, but you make them pay anyways. In this case, the vote of the group that was the majority in the group, their rights trump that the individuals don't want to pay. Now, I guess it's relevant if those people consented to a system where they said, if I lose the vote, I'm willing to do what the majority does, right? But like in our society, we don't do that. You don't necessarily consent to that system or overtly say that. So like, I pay this because other people voted it. The group rights overweighs me wanting to keep more of my money. That's just the world we live in today, right? So pretty much, I guess the point I'm getting at is there are times where, say, the United States government imposes things on me as an individual, and I can't opt out of them, right? So I'm at the will of the group. I'm at the will of the state. At this point, I don't have certain things that the state has taken from me and is asking of me. And that's just because that's the way, like, this group this civilization I live in has been created. So I would say, definitionally, that's collectivist, because the individual, which is me, does not have like the last say on it. So somebody else is deciding for me what I'm going to do because I'm a member of this broad coalition. So that I would define that as collectivist, because my rights are losing out to the group's rights, whether I want them to or not. In an individualist society, or an individualist world, the individual's choice would always reign supreme over the group's choice. Because even if a group wanted to do something, you would say, it's kind of like the idea, the universal imperative with Kant. He says you'll never use an individual as a means to an end. So in a group that says, okay, Matt, I know you don't like this, but you're in the minority, and everybody else wants to pay taxes for this, and I know you say no, but only like 10 people say no, so we're going to tax you anyways. I'm being used as like a means to an end here. In that group. So does that clarify, I guess, why I like those definitions at all? Or does that just mean nothing to you?
I mean, it clarifies. I'm not sure. Right, well, this just gets to the heart of the disagreement, I think. So I guess I'll leave the taxation example aside for a moment. We can return to it if you wish. But I'll just say this. That there are situations, I think, in which the individual should have supreme, or should be supreme. But if you are a part of a community, then there are situations in which that community should be supreme. Otherwise, there really can't be a community as such. And I don't think just because you give up a certain amount of freedom or a certain kind of freedom just to be in a community, I don't think is inherently wrong. And I guess I could tie it back into your Kant example. If I go to a grocery store, and I'm checking out, I'm using the cashier for my ends. I'm saying, okay, if I pay you, if I interact with you, I give you the money. You'll do whatever you do in your in the cash register and whatnot, and so I'm using you to get my groceries. I mean, I'm using the cashier is basically in my way between me having a house full of groceries. And I guess I would say to Kant that that's not a problem because the cashier, at least in theory, is consenting to that job. So I'm not even saying that it's not even necessarily wrong to use someone as a means to an end in certain situations.
Yeah, I think bringing up Kant was probably an error on my part. It's just one of those things that was part of my early college experience was learning about Kant, so I think about that a lot. But I guess I would say the difference in our examples was about consent, because I was saying I would not consent to something, and the group would use me as a means anyways to get to their ends. But let's not dwell on that too much. Now, I brought up taxes, which is stupid of me because we obviously disagree on the validity of taxation. But maybe a way that we could kind of delve into the real issues by taking something that you would actually see as like a fundamental right. So maybe we should talk about like freedom of speech. And I think your response made me kind of want to suss out something that might be a distinction worth thinking about. So in the United States, I can't get imprisoned for saying things. I can get imprisoned for doing things, but the First Amendment protects me in a lot of ways. But with that being said, like I live in a predominantly my minority area. So if I went outside and started screaming racial slurs, like the government won't arrest me for the words I'm saying, but odds are somebody would probably beat me within an inch of my life, right? Because that's what's going to happen if you go in an area and you scream things that society wouldn't be happy with you screaming outside that are very contentious. So I guess what I'm saying is someone could say, well, Matt, that means like you living in this society, you're giving up this freedom because you can't go and shout that outside. Now, I don't really think that's what freedom really means, because I guess I don't think of freedom as a freedom from any and all consequences. I think of it as like freedom from, I guess, arbitrary government intervention. And that's kind of why I find it hard to talk about rights a lot of time, is because it's like, okay, well, you can have this right, but what does that truly mean? And that's why I like thinking of like the Bill of Rights as like our freedoms from government. These are things the government cannot infringe. But it doesn't mean that if you go and you scream at a person's face and call them obscenities, they're not going to beat the tar out of you. You know what I mean? So when we're talking about when we're looking at this through the lens of what Wes Cecil was saying, and we're talking about society, it's like, what are we really talking about when we talk about freedom? And that's a whole can of worms, because we talk about the difference between like consequences that are natural and also like what consequences can be legislated. I just felt like that was important to maybe suss that out based on kind of what you were saying. Did you find these two? I find these two things very different, right? So I think if I screw somebody over in day-to-day life and then they want retribution against me, I almost think that's more legitimate than I broke a rule that overlords decided or that 60% of people voted on, right? I think there's a difference between these two things, and I don't think one of them is an infringement on my liberty, and I think the other one is. Do you think these things are pretty much the same? Because I think that might be a thing that is often an undertone in our discussions, where I think you think these things are more similar than I do.
What things exactly are you referring to?
So like, let's say So when I break a law that that people who voted in legislators made, I don't think I think that's still arbitrary. I think I should be allowed to do that. I think I should be free from these laws if they're not harming anybody. But if I go outside and I start shouting vulgar terms because freedom of speech, I should be allowed to shout vulgar terms, but I've broken this societal rule because somebody's like, you can't shout that outside, I'm going to beat you up, Matt. I think these two things are very different, right? And I don't think that just because somebody beats me up because I'm shouting terrible things outside, I don't find that like an infringement on my freedom, but I would if the government made it illegal and threw me in a cage. I think these are like two very different types of consequences. And one of the things with Wes Cecil's kind of undertones of what he's saying is, well, you make trade-offs, and both these are trade-offs. And I don't really think it's that simple. I think that might be an undertone to when I start talking about how these principles apply to government versus regular voluntary interactions. The interplay there, I think, is different. Does that make sense at all?
I think I follow you. So if I respond to an incorrect argument, feel free to correct the record. Okay, so to take your little thought experiment, I guess then my answer would be, I do think those two things are similar, in that they are both, if you break a law, versus if somebody beats you up for shouting obscenities. Okay.
So I guess the distinction I'm trying to make is when we're talking about things, I think it's very valid if like I do something bad, like I do something that breaks social norms, if we state it broadly. If I break social norms and there are repercussions, like it hurts my reputation, it hurts my brand, it hurts employment, I understand that, and I think that's all valid. Now, I don't think it follows from that because I'm willing to engage in these societal norms, then it's like, well, then what Cecil implies? Well, taxation is just another trade-off. It's just another thing you do in society. And I'm like, no, it's not really though. One of these things is me interacting with people with kind of sanity and decency and making sure nobody fights back. And then he'll say, well, that's a trade-off you make to live in this society. And then it almost is implied by him that, yeah, and then following like laws that you don't agree with, that's also a thing you should just do. And that's also valid. And I don't think these things are related, and I don't think you can just group them. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. And I'm kind of offended that he groups them because I think it's like a really lazy thing to say. It's lazy to just say, well, you don't cuss in people's faces and get in fights because you're willing to accept society exists. So that also means you should be able to accept getting shaken down for a third of your income. And I don't think those things are related. I guess that's the distinction I'm trying to draw. You just muted yourself, by the way.
I guess I'm just not sure. Again, we conceptualize this very differently. I think, and again, you can go back if anyone's listening to this, particular podcast. You can go back to the one right before this where I say, in my ideal situation, the state disappears. But to a certain extent, and not completely, we both agree that if you're not hurting somebody else, then there really should be no law against whatever behavior you're engaging in. But I see the state as just a extension of a certain kind of social. It's an extension of social norms to an extent, because the state is supposed to give you, for submission or whatever you want to say, for following its laws, following its commands, however you want to put it. And I know you don't agree with this, but it's supposed to be giving something back to you. It's not a simply parasitic relationship. It can be partly parasitic, and some governments are more parasitic than others. But the very reason we have states at all, we have had states at all in history, is to sort of smooth over the social norms, or generalize the social norms across various situations, and we follow to the extent that we follow social norms. We follow certain aspects of the state, but I'm really not. Again, I'm just not that really. I don't quite understand the distinction here. I mean, to be okay, you mentioned the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective, but you also don't really like the conception of rights at all. So, just I'm repeating myself, I think, but just to be in a group. I mean, I think Wes Cecil, one of the examples he gives is a band. If you're in a band, or if you form a band, you have to sacrifice some things in order to be part of that band. You and I, we created this podcast together. We are sacrificing our time, and not only that, we have to come to certain agreement about what we're going to talk about at any particular week. We give each other a certain amount of respect, obviously. So I guess that would be my response. Is I don't think it's a question of the individual's rights versus the group rights. I think it depends on the situation you're referring to, whether the individual or the group is paramount.
So maybe this is why Wes Cecil what was so frustrating to me, because I felt like maybe it wasn't actually about it. Well, I kind of already said that I don't think it's really encaptures the debate, because all of the interactions he talks about are voluntary, right? So at the base level, you already know that people can leave or opt out, and it's not really that the group overrides the individual in voluntary transactions. It's that you're willing to compromise. So like if you have a band, it's not that you have to do anything. The four people can't hold you down and make you play guitar. It would be like you'd be willing to compromise. Like, I'll play this guy's song even though I hate it, but at least I know that I like the other 7 songs on our album, so I'll compromise. That's a trade-off I'm willing to make. But what I see a lot in governance and a lot of collective things that kind of are so large that you can't really escape being part of it, like being an American. You can't really it's tough to escape that, or it's tough to escape being characterized as some group based on your nation. It's kind of inevitable wherever you live, and in that categorization you're going to run into some troubles against the group, where the overwhelming majority of that group has made certain calculations that you are a subject to, whether you really want to be or not. And you can't really it's not really a compromise because you don't really have a choice, right? So I guess where that would be is, it doesn't have to be taxation, but it could be any popular law that is really keeping you from doing something. So if anything has like overwhelming support from, I guess, the left and the right, so things that don't really get discussed, and that's why I always go to taxation, is because it's not like the Republicans or Democrats are really trying to abolish the IRS. Like, they aren't. So it's just something that's popular. But then I see somebody could say, well, I don't like that, but I'm subjected to it, and there's not a lot you can do about it. So I see the group reigns in on the individual, and it's less of a compromise, because it's like, what are you going to really do about it? So maybe that's where I get frustrated there. So, gosh, I lost the other point when you started talking, that was coming to mind. I think it was just about the real differences between other interactions and then the specific interaction with say like the so when I'm with my friends, it's a completely different dynamic, and I wouldn't say that's even necessarily collectivist. I know what Wes Cecil gives the example of ordering a pizza, right? So, and he pretty much says, well, if you have 4 people and you're all going to split a pizza, it's really hard to actually figure out what kind of pizza to get because you're balancing, 4 people's different preferences all on one flavor, and then somebody's going to have to suck it up, but whatever, you got your pizza. It just seems like such a far cry from the reaches he wants to make. So I just feel like the points he's making, although I'll grant him that sometimes working in a voluntary group is much better than working as an individual, I just don't see how this justifies things very, very far beyond that. And okay, so we can try to move past this roadblock. I have another adjacent thought, and the adjacent thought is I feel like people are too quick to group people in with various groups that they only loosely apply to. For example, everybody's grouped based on their region in several different ways, right? So I'm grouped based on where I live now, as in the state. I'm grouped based on the city I live in now. So like I'm a Pennsylvanian right now. I'm a Philadelphian right now, but I'm a ex-California native. So people group me as a former Californian, former Southern Californian. They'll even group me based on my high school, whether I went to public school or private school, as if these things are defining characteristics of a group that I, actively wish to be involved with. And it's like this overemphasis on vague groups that I don't even really identify with, but they technically apply to me. And I think that this happens a lot. And then people can jump once you get, oh, you're a resident of Pennsylvania. Well, you're an American, and then people use this to justify things about the group you're involved in, right? So it's like, as a young person, it's better for young people if you support this policy. Or as an American, most Americans are for this, so you should fall in line. But there are 200 and, hundreds of millions of Americans. So how do I don't really need to identify with it for it to be used against me. That's something I see a lot with all these labels about large groups, and then it's almost wielded as a blunt instrument in a way. I was thinking about that a lot. So these aren't groups like my friends and family that Wes Cecil talks about a lot. These are things that are beyond me that are just kind of coincidental. And I find it kind of weird that those are used as utilitarian, like a utilitarian person will use that as a justification to say I belong to a certain subset of mankind, to make a point that I'm obligated to do something. It's just kind of all odd to me. So how do you feel about me saying that's kind of arbitrary, and it makes me feel like I'm just having things forced on me? Does that like strike you as like red alert flags that I'm going wrong somewhere?
I mean, I feel like the rain that's like ruining the parade, just because I don't. Maybe we're talking past each other, or I'm just not fully grasping your side of the story. But I mean, like, I don't really being a part of groups is just kind of the way that human beings function. So like when you say, oh, I was forced to be, or I'm forced to be a Philadelphian or a Pennsylvanian or a Southern Californian, I mean, I don't see. I'm not sure what's being forced on you. I mean, you kids, okay, so what's being forced on you is this idea that you were a former Southern Californian, and so what? Like, people are going to judge you based on that. Okay. I mean, I'm not. I guess you have to flesh this out more. I don't quite know what I'm working with here.
Well, the point I was making there is there are a bunch of broad collectives that are applied to me just because it's a fact, right? So it's like, oh, it's a fact you were born in California. You are a Californian. This is part of your identity. Whether you really care or not, it's a true fact, and that there's a group of people who are former Californians, and then we will call them like past Californians, right? So this is a group that I don't identify with anybody with. I probably don't share an interest with them, but we all exist and we have a quality in common. So then like, well, now I live in Philadelphia. I'm a person who's a resident of that of the city of Philadelphia. So now people are like, okay, well, there are millions of people who live in this geographic location, but because all these people you don't know think a certain way, here are your obligations, right? So like there are these things where I'm seemingly grouped with people who I don't have any associations with. I don't really share interest in them with them in most ways. Even if you make a case about like, well, a lot of you have access to public transportation. It's like, well, but maybe I don't want it. Maybe I want to line somewhere else. It doesn't follow that we share any interests, even though we all live in the same like 50-mile radius, right? So but now since I chose to live here for other reasons, I'm now in this group, this amalgamation of people in the zone, and now I'm at the will of this body of people just because I live in the region, whether I share interests with them or not. I understand that there's some basis for it, like it is a fact that I fall in a certain amount of coordinates on the globe. Like I would agree to that. But it all seems that my connection with like 10 people is very strong in this region, and my connection with the rest is loose at best, and our interests are often conflicting. But then I'm at this group's will anyways, and it seems wrong to me because it seems like, yes, we share this one arbitrary trait, and it's like I agree that that is literally true. But now because of that, it seems just it is almost an instinct that is just that I can have things forced on me if a majority of these people agree on something, and it's just an odd thought to me, and it strikes me as that's a collectivist notion, is that since you're part of this body that shares this one quality, if people agree on something, you are at the will of it. And I understand that different rules apply if I'm in a certain neighborhood and people have certain norms, but it doesn't even feel like I'm even that closely related to this people in this huge geographic region. And you can expand it to, federal policy and say everybody in the whole country, even if they're 2,000 miles away. I guess what I'm saying is the things that make collective bodies are kind of arbitrary, yet we use those collective bodies' existence to justify very things that are directly related to you, and it doesn't really matter if you truly share an interest or not. So like I understand communes, right? If there's a commune all living together, you guys do share an interest because you're all literally like sharing the same food. You're all literally working together, eating your meals together. If somebody is sick, somebody has to care for them, and you're directly seeing the impact. I get it because there's like 15 people, so that's like a group that makes sense. But even at like a large group where you're not going to know 99.9% of the people there, it's just, and like, you don't know my life. I don't share an interest with these people. It's hard to see how you could justify these group policies if I don't agree to it. And I know that's kind of like, I use the word force, and that I don't mean to harken back to social contract stuff. I'm inevitably doing it. It's just an inevitability of it all. But it's almost like this group quality isn't even really a true thing we have in common. So yeah, I think that's clarification that might be helpful, maybe.
I don't really. Okay, so here's, I guess, how I would square that circle. So, it just goes back again to just the fact that we are social animals, and to be okay. So you live in Philadelphia. I'm sure there are certain laws that apply to Philadelphia. And you can say, "Oh, I don't like Philadelphia. I don't care that I'm a Philadelphian," and blah. You can say all that, which is fine. It doesn't really matter at some level. But if you choose to live in Philadelphia, and I guess this is kind of where it does go back to social contract theory, you are saying, well, there are trade-offs to live here. There are benefits to live in Philadelphia. Then there might be cons, or there might be bad things about living in Philadelphia. But I've reasoned that the good things outweigh the bad things. There are certain social norms that are going to be here that might not be elsewhere. I consent to those social norms. And if I don't like I mean, what's one reason maybe that people move all over the country or all over the world? Maybe because they don't like this particular group or that particular group. Some people might not like the United States, so they move to a completely other country. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But to be in a group, I guess I'd put it to you like this. Even if you live in let's imagine we live in your perfect society, so an anarcho-capitalist society. There will be certain norms that you need to follow in that anarcho-capitalist society. The norms will be, the non-aggression principle. You can't use force against someone unless they don't use force against you, and if you do, then you're violating a norm, and you can be accosted or something. You can be punished at some level for that. Whether there's some like anarcho-capitalist jail that you have, or whether it's just threats of violence from the person you supposedly were aggressive towards. There's some cost. There's going to be some cost to not following the rules of this society. And so what I'm trying to say is that to be again, I'm sorry, I feel like a broken record here, but you need to be, if you're going to be a part of a group, there's just certain groups have certain kind of ways of functioning, and that's just kind of the way it has to be. And you can say that's a violation of my freedom. I don't consent to that. Well, then you kind of have to go. You have to find another group that you do consent to, at least the closest thing you can find that you consent to, and going to that group.
Okay, so I think I kind of see the jump that I don't like, and I kind of think I could see where I think my ideology and what my prescription kind of resolves it, and what I think might be another core problem with things in general. So the jump I'm not really liking is the jump from a member of a group, meaning the group as a whole, or the laws that are around a group. So and this is kind of why I don't like how loosely a group is defined. So like a group can be as loosely defined as you live in Philadelphia. Well, if I go out with a girl who lives in Philadelphia, I'm going out with her because of her. But because we both happen to live in Philadelphia, we are now subject to like every law under Philadelphia's books, because that's the group that we both happen to incidentally, be a part of. It's not that we want to be part of that group. It's that that is a group that we're loosely related to. But now, like, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is we're now at the subject to all these rules that are some other people brought that are kind of unrelated to us. But what you were kind of saying is, well, if I want to interact with the group, I have to interact with the group's rules. It's not really that I want to interact with the group. It's that I want to interact with 5 people out of 100 million, and they all happen to live in a certain region, and that region has laws. So it's not really that they're the group. It's 5 random people. It could be members of my family. It could be a girl I want to date. It could be a place that I want to buy cigarettes from. Like, but now I'm subject to all these laws because they happen to be in a landmass. And I'm not really satisfied with the answer of, well, then pick a different one, because, well, one, it then cuts out all the people who happen to live on that landmass incidentally. But the other one is every place is pretty much has a government. So you just can only pick the least worst one. You can't really pick, I don't want arbitrary rules pushed down on me because I want to have 2 friends. So I think it's the jump from here's a member of a group. Therefore, if you want to interact with them, you have to abide by a ton of rules, a plethora of rules, even if that them being a member of that group is only as incidental of this is the place they were born, 18 years ago. I just don't think that's a satisfying enough answer to justify it. Now, part of the reason why I think, part of how I think I would resolve this is I think this is the inevitable problem with public property owned by the government. So it's hard for me to say any street should have a given rule, because if public property is supposed to be the property of the people, well, who am I to tell these people what they can and can't do? You could say social norms. So we were talking about social norms earlier, and you're saying even in my ANCAP society, we would have social norms. Well, everybody would have private property, and on people's private property, you'd have to observe whatever their rules were. And probably, if you're in the same region, maybe a lot of those people come from the same kind of backgrounds. So maybe those rules would be shared, but they wouldn't have to be. That's the thing. And if you don't like it, you just are like, oh, I won't go to that diner anymore, or I won't go to the people who live on that block anymore because those people have these defined rules I don't agree with. But in our society right now, pretty much the all public property is run under the same set of rules, and you can't really do anything about it unless you lobby, half the city to decide on something that you like or want to be enforced. But when you have private property, you can have a bar, and if anybody curses, you can kick them out because it's your bar. So you can say, I have a zero tolerance for foul language. Any of these people, hey, this is my rules, deal with it. And I'm perfectly fine with that. But right now, we have a place where a bunch of property is designated public property, even though rules are forced on it. When it's like, well, who's supposed to own this? I don't know. It seems to me that public property is a big issue when it comes to defining these things. But I know you're not a big fan of property rights necessarily, and I think property rights resolves a lot of these issues because if you don't like what somebody does, you just go somewhere else. And it's simple because people will have vastly different norms. But when you think about governments, they're on average very similar. Just some are worse than others, but even like the most lenient ones still tax you at a high rate. So I think with actual private property, though, you'd get a wider range, which is way better because some people wouldn't care at all, or you own your own property so you can make your own rules instead of I happen to live here and it's the least worst one. I think that's a more satisfying answer. And I know that's a long rant, and I covered like 4 unrelated topics. So you can unpack that or whatever things you maybe found interesting, or if maybe you're not amused. I could see that still.
Well, no, I'm not really amused. And that's not. I guess it just goes back to really the first thing I kind of said during this whole podcast. So when I don't see what the logical inconsistency is, or the incorrect, why it's incorrect to say, well, if I'm interacting with someone in a particular community, I have to follow that community's rules, just because we have to have community. I mean, it's a necessity. There are very, very. I mean, okay, you might be able to find a few people out there who are just completely fine with being in a cabin in the woods completely by themselves, but on that those probably aren't the healthy people. What was it, the Unabomber? I mean, he lived in a cabin in the woods. You can't. I mean, we're social beings by nature. That's just inevitable. That's a fact of life. So you to be healthy, you have to interact with groups. Now, some of those groups you didn't choose to be in, such as a family. You don't choose to be in your family. Or friends. Now, you do choose to interact with a friend group. But, if you live in a society, you, at some level, you are consenting to those rules. Now, if you're in a society, you can try to change those rules through activism, through education, through just talking to people. Rules in a particular community aren't necessarily static, and they shouldn't be. We should live in a world where norms can change based on a situation, and where better norms can be adopted, and norms that aren't very helpful or are detrimental to the individual or the community can be dispensed with. But there will always be norms. And law is kind of an extension of those norms, and government is an extension of those laws. Doesn't mean the government is always right. Doesn't mean all those norms are always correct. Obviously, they're not. I can give you, I could probably write a book, or someone could write a book about all the stupid laws, all the awful things governments do, all the awful norms that they propagate. But that doesn't invalidate norms, and that, I would even say, it doesn't necessarily invalidate governments, given the kind of the way the world is structured right now, and given the way that human nature is. But I reiterate this again. I'm not a fan of governments. I think, governments need to be dispensed with. We can have we don't have to have governments.
Okay.
But I am not so. It doesn't matter to me. Certain things governments do don't matter to me, because, as I say, I see them as an extension of social norms.
Okay, so here's your. I'm going to be bold. I'm going to say, and I think that this is a better way of wording it, and I think this might be how we stop missing each other. My real claim is you're broadening society too large. That is my claim. So I live in Philadelphia, and it is a huge area, and norms are very different in all parts of Philadelphia, and we're all ruled by the Philadelphia government, even though most of us have nothing in common with each other, whether it be socioeconomically, whether it be race, background, how we were raised. There are college kids right next to very low-income families that have nothing in common. Then you go into South Philly, and it's all, you go into Center City, it's all very affluent people. You go into Old City, it's even more of the kind. There's a whole business district, and it's all run under this city that generally is segregated in the sense that they don't interact with all the parts of the city, but they're all ruled the same way, and it seems very arbitrary. So I guess what I'm saying is, when you talk about these norms aren't even true from household to household on my block. As you go further down Diamond Street, you hit people who are college kids after hitting families that have lived in this area for decades and decades. These groups have almost nothing in common. So when you talk about social norms, it's like, well, you're telling me that I have to operate under laws created by the majority of this huge group of people because I want to hang out with two people and get pizza at this shop in this specific neighborhood. All of this is very arbitrary, and I think this is one of the true problems of this line of thinking, is when you say society and society norms. I obviously agree with that. It's like I have certain norms with people I interact with. We can say certain things and it's fine. Certain jokes are acceptable, certain are unacceptable. That's all to be expected. But I guess what I'm saying is, when society gets broadened out in the ways it clearly has been all across our country, especially when people talk about America as a whole, it's almost like you've broadened it out to a point where nobody has anything in common except for very small things. And then we still push more and more stuff that's specific onto all of them. And it seems like completely ridiculous. So I guess that's what I would say the error is you're taking society, I interact with 5 people in a 1 mile radius and saying, so you should be subject to the United States of America's regulations because you went and had a beer at one place, right? So let's stick with the thought. I think you're broadening out society much further than my few relationships truly extend to. And then you're applying these very broad out rules to me because I have these very small, specific relationships or business transactions. That's what seems ridiculous to me. Is that more clear, I guess?
Yeah, that's more clear. And I had a point I was going to make, and I just completely forgot it. So I'm just gonna ramble for a minute and hope that I come across the point I was going to make. Okay, so this is very helpful, actually. So I feel like this conversation's going somewhere now. Okay, so you would say that I am broadening out society too much, and okay, I remember what I was going to say. So norms aren't the same from person to person, from household to household, from community to community, even within even within a city, even within a state, even within a country, even within the world. Okay, that's fine. But and this goes back to almost another disagreement that we've had before. Where do these norms come from, and why do we have certain norms? And I would say that if you study human nature, an elusive thing, hard to define, I grant you that. If you think about human nature, if you think about just the way humans are, what a human needs to thrive, there are overarching social norms that are universally applicable. Now, that doesn't mean there are other social norms that are much more individualistic or vary more than others, and that's fine. I don't use foul language around my grandfather just because I know he doesn't like foul language. But if I'm with my best friend, we can curse all we want. Nobody cares. That's fine. There's no problem there. That's just a different way of interacting with different people. So, I mean, I guess maybe in some strange way we agree. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with different communities having different social norms. But there's also a certain norms that we all agree with. We all agree we shouldn't murder. We all agree that there's certain things that we just don't do as people. And so to that extent, you are responsible to the community at large.
Okay, so I agree with what you just said, and I think no. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do something sneaky, and I'm gonna take what you just said, say I agree with it. Then I'm gonna take something else you said, and I'm gonna agree with that too. And then I'm gonna say, and that's why government's evil. Defend what you just said and walk back some things to reconcile your thoughts. So I just agreed with what you say about how people have different norms, but some are overarching, some are universal, and I like this. We're getting somewhere. This is the point I was trying to come to, and this is the part that I thought I'd bring out of you. So we just had to get to this point. Now it makes sense. Okay, so we have these universal things. It's bad to murder people. It's bad to walk into people's house at night, shoot their dog, and steal their TV. Like, you can't do that. It's not cool. Nobody would agree on that. So there obviously there's laws to that. But then here's the nasty thing that happens. Then you get the laws that 52% of people have the norms for. 52% of the people are like, you know what? I think healthcare is right. And I think we should tax everybody and universalize that right now, tomorrow. And then you get 48% who go, I also live in the United States of America, coincidentally as you, and there's 48% of us, and we don't want to do that. Our norm is against it. This is why government is authoritarian and evil. Because then government gives those 52% the power that won the election. It gives the majority, gives these people who have gotten the people they like into power to then take their norms that other people don't agree with and then violently force it on other people. And if they don't like it, they throw them in a cage. So because like you said earlier, laws are extensions of social norms. And it's the social norms of the majorities, but oftentimes a lot of norms are slim majorities. And so I guess what I'm asking you to reconcile is, I agree that that's what laws are, and social norms vary, and some social norms are universal. But the problem with government is it takes these people who are loosely similar, takes the consensus social norms, and then forces them on everybody, even if some aren't actually much better than other people's, or it's fair that other people disagree. Well, hey, you both live in the United States, so all of it's forced on all of you, even though it has 52% approval, whether you like it or not. So I guess what I'm saying is, you can defend universal norms, and you can say, oh yeah, norms are different, that's okay. But then government's clearly the one that takes the slight edge and then forces it on everybody, whether you like it or not. And it's often for arbitrary reasons, like you both live in the United States of America. That's why I think it's ridiculous, right? I think this is the full realization of the point I was trying to make. So what do you think of that in terms of, yes, it can universalize norms we all agree on, but it could also, top down, force down norms that not everybody agrees on?
Okay, yeah, this is good. We are getting somewhere. I feel there was a little bit there when I was like, I'm not sure about this conversation, Matt, but now I feel justified. Now I feel like we've actually accomplished something here. Okay, but to answer your question, so how can I justify a majority if it's a slim majority? If like you said, healthcare. If most people think healthcare is right, but a chunk people don't. How can I say, I'm for universal healthcare? You're trampling on the rights of those who don't think healthcare
Wait,
is
you're not
right.
just trampling on the rights; you're trampling on their norms.
Trampling
That's
on the norms. Okay, so I'm trampling on their norms. How do I reconcile that? How do I decide? How do we decide as a society? I suppose you could put it this way: what norms to favor and what not to favor. And I guess you would say, well, in an anarcho-capitalist society, there's private property, and norms just vary based on private property. And if you don't like norms on one particular piece of private property, you go somewhere else. Okay. What I would
wait, I would add on that, and then everybody's happy because everybody can just do what they want.
Okay, got it. And what I would say, and it goes back to another disagreement we have on democracy and whether democracy is justified and whether democracy is authoritarian. Because I do think healthcare is a right, and I'm more than happy. I would be more than happy to use the government to enforce that. I would be more than happy to have government-run healthcare in which everybody has access to it. Doesn't matter if you're Bill Gates. Doesn't matter if you're me. We all have it. Doesn't bother me that the government is doing that. And it doesn't bother me if there are people who disagree with that, because that's kind of the point of democracy. The point of democracy is to come to a consensus, and to get the greatest number of people you can to, or it's to find out what the greatest number of people want, and implementing those ideas. And if you don't like what the majority thinks, you need to help persuade the majority that they're wrong, so you can change those norms to the norms that you think are correct.
So, okay. Yeah, because this leads us down a very democracy versus anti-democracy line of thinking and discussion, which I don't know if we want to pursue that much. But I think what you just argued, when the way that you just argued for the perks of democracy, was essentially saying the argument, the definition of collectivism I laid out at the beginning of the podcast was what you were saying, though. Because democracy is about consensus. It's about getting the majority. And then when the group comes up with the majority, you then enforce it on everybody. And if you had the pure individualist thing I laid out earlier, you get my vision, which is everybody has private property. You have your norms on your private property. You don't hurt anybody. You don't force them to do anything, because you can always leave and go to somebody else's property. Or on your own property, you can do what you want, as long as you're not, dragging people onto yours. But then that would involve like different kinds of, violence that are obviously unacceptable. So I guess what I'm saying is, what you just defined as, like, I guess, pure democracy, even like that they use the force of a state, is pretty much that definition of collectivism. And what I lay out as my pure version of anarchic capitalism is the definition I gave of individualism, where I'm saying you can use your individual property to live out the norms that you want or your family wants, and you can have your own rules, and you can interact with other people who like your rules, because we're not okay with having the group make anybody change how they're acting or at least in terms of using the government apparatus to do it. Now, I think the whole thing of like murder, I think that gets addressed in ways that are even outside of the whole paradigm. Because if your family, somebody gets shot by a person in a different family, and then you go and shoot them back, is it really because you believe the group rights triumph the individual rights? It's like, well, not really. You just believe in defending your family, and I don't really even think that has anything to do with group rights. It more has to do with the fact that you like love your family member. I think that that whole conversation exists in a separate paradigm. Really, the collectivist individualist problem is saying, are we okay using group force on members of the group that don't want to actually go along with the agenda, right? And you're kind of saying that's fine if there's consensus. And I don't think that's a bad point to make, considering that the overwhelming majority of Americans agree with you. And that's why people complain that our democracy isn't pure enough, and not that the problem is democracy in and of itself. That's the argument I make, and I'm a minority for making it. But I'm just saying that that argument is collectivist, which is why we're having this conversation.
Well, no, I know I don't agree, because I don't think you can't put me in a box and say, oh, you're a collectivist, because I just don't agree with that box. Just because I believe in universal healthcare. And again, I mean, I keep being in a position where I have to defend the state when my ideal is without a state, but so, in an ideal situation, you don't have to do that, because people would just have the opportunity to, or there would just be enough people, enough doctors around, and you wouldn't need to force it top down, because I think human society would gravitate in such a way to get everybody perfect, or not perfect, would get everybody healthcare overall. Yes.
But living in our world today, it's like we can talk about, I guess, our different ideals and why. But I guess the reason why I'm okay resorting to my ideal is because I don't defend anything that would perpetuate government now. So everything that I say, if anything I might support, is at least incrementally working towards my end goal. But you're willing to support things that do involve a state, even though your ideal doesn't have a state. So I guess what I'm saying, I guess if I was going to make this claim, and I'm going to make a very narrow claim, it is, if I give you the definition of collectivist I made earlier in the show, which is here, I'll read it again. Collectivism, any of several types of social organization in which the individual is seen as being subordinate to a social collectivity, such as a state, etc. So I guess I'm saying, if you're not arguing from your ideal, if you're arguing for universal healthcare in our world today, you are arguing for a situation where even if you disagree with a collective body, you are a subordinate of it, right? You think that if you voted against it, it doesn't matter. Here's the outcome. And it's like, hey, that tons of people will make that argument. It's fine to. But that is an inherently collectivist position by the definition of you're saying the individual is subordinate to the group here, even if he disagrees. Now, I would say I'm not a collectivist because I wouldn't defend that. I wouldn't think it's just that the individual is legally enforced to be subjugated by the state there, right? So I know you can point to your ideal, but if I want to make this narrow claim, and it is what a policy you would defend in today's paradigm, like, I think you are a collectivist in that sense, in that narrow sense. You are, like, how is that not that definition? How are you not subjugated, if you disagree, by the collective body?
Because to say that I'm I disagree with it just for a very narrow and simple reason, and that's because I'm, or I could put it like this: I'm willing to agree with you if we acknowledge the specific nature of the situation. And I just don't agree with you in the sense that if you just label someone as a collectivist, that basically what you're basically saying is, oh, they don't care about individual liberty at all. They don't care about the individual in all situations, in all circumstances. You trample on the individual's rights, no problem. And so that's just why I disagree with your wording of it, because you can. It just depends on the situation, and in that situation, fine, you could say that's collectivist, but I'm not willing to say I'm a collectivist overall because I just don't agree with that narrow dichotomy. I think it depends on the situation, and in other situations, I am far more individual. I would fall in the camp of individualist.
Well, and I guess what I completely am fine with you making that distinction. That was the distinction I was trying to make. I was trying to say that the position you described is inherently and definitionally a collectivist position. I don't mean that you would defend every proposition any majority agreed with. I know the last couple episodes you mentioned something along the lines of saying you wouldn't agree to the social contract in Soviet Russia or in Germany, in with Hitler in charge. So I obviously would say you'd think those are illegitimate, and you would take an individualist stance to resist there, or thinking that people should be able to opt out. Now, here's the thing. I guess here's where I'm drawing the line further. Although I know you wouldn't trade away individuals' rights for anything, you trade it for the stuff you like. And I guess that came off a little more sneering than I wanted it to. But one thing that the Libertarian Party does this thing where they're really smug and they have terrible messaging. So one thing the Libertarian Party does when they message poorly is they kind of grandstand and they say we are the principled party. But part of the Libertarian Party is being principled, especially on this issue, because I don't think there is a dynamic where I'm okay with the individual specifically being subjugated to the group. Anytime I think an individual works in a group for a group, they're doing it for the individual's purpose. So like when I'm with my family, I'm doing it because I personally feel like I have an obligation to my family, and or I enjoy being with my family, right? So these are things that serve myself, that makes me part of a group. But now when we're talking about government, I can't agree with really anything that subjugates the individual. So I think I'm an individualist at all times, and at sometimes you're going to be a collectivist when it comes to things like universal health care. But there are other times where you're obviously not going to be a collectivist, and I think that's fine. I'm just saying you have a range here, and I have no tolerance for the whole idea of being subjugated to the group for really any reason. I think that's the point I was trying to make. And I'm not saying everything you say is invalid because of that. I've talked to you for 20. This is the 24th episode we've done, excluding the missing episodes. I wouldn't spend 27, 20, 30 hours talking to you if I thought everything you said was invalid because you're a collectivist. I'm not trying to attach a label to you so I could smear every point you make for the rest of your life. That's not my intention. I'm just trying to label it in terms of this conversation and in terms of thinking about it like in an abstract way, how I would categorize that thought. And politics are toxic. It's actually really impressive we've done so many of these without actually getting very angry at each other. And so I just want to remind you, I don't want to smear you with a label. It's just, I'm just trying to describe things in the way that's relevant here.
But I would say, by my definition of collectivism, but by my understanding of this conversation or this debate, you are a collectivist whenever you are submitting to the social norms of a particular group. Now you just disagree with that definition of collectivism, and that's fine. But that's how I would. That's why I think we're all individualists and collectivists at different times, and you can't just label somebody for all times and for all intents and purposes as one or the other, because we both need individual liberty and a group connection. You can't have, as I said, you can't be a healthy person and only have one of those. You need both. You are a collectivist when you are with your family. You are a collectivist when you are with your friends. You are a collectivist in the sense that you are living in the United States. But you are an individual. You are an individual, or you're even a collectivist in the sense that you're doing this podcast. But you are an individual in the sense that I assume you choose what you have for dinner. You don't submit to other people unless you're in a group. I assume you're an individualist in the sense that you chose the job you have. So there are other examples in which you are an individualist.
One interesting things about a lot of the discussions, and I'm not talking about just with us, but like in any popular discussion about it, is that things can be interpreted in a lot of ways because a word sounds a certain way and people use it in different ways. Um, but both definitions we're using will come up if you search individualist or collectivist. So I guess that's why I've had these. I'm focusing on one part because there's one part we clearly disagree on, right? And it's how if we use my definitions, we are actually on different poles, and if we use your definition, then we just both agree. And I think it's because what you're describing is you're saying, well, collectivism is human nature because humans operate not alone and aren't self-reliant. So of course I agree. I think that's true. Um, I just don't think it's I guess I don't think it's a philosophical point. I think it's just a descriptive point. Um, now I guess if I was to challenge you, I would say this. I would say, okay, well, if I accept your definition of collectivism being that loose, but then I feel like I have to use a stronger word than collectivism, I'd have to use a different word to describe what you support. But when I say any state, I pretty much in the past said anytime the state subjugates an individual, that's authoritarianism. And then you weren't happy with my usage of the word authoritarianism in that time. So I guess I would challenge you to say, okay, well, what do you call it when somebody is subjugated by the group and then they don't want to be subjugated by the group, but they are anyways? It's like, what's the word for that if that's not like a collectivist situation? Because I don't agree with that. So if I'm a collectivist in your term, then what am I pushing back against when I talk about the government in this whole discord we've been having? I don't know what word would define it if that's off the table besides like authoritarian, but I don't think you like that term either.
What you are pushing back against, or what we are mostly disagreeing about, just goes back to the legitimacy or illegitimacy of a state. That is really the core of our disagreement in terms of taxes, in terms of healthcare, and in other issues as well. That's really what I think we disagree about.
Well, I know what we disagree about, but I guess I'm saying if I can't define it as I disagree with like this type of authoritarianism because something's getting pushed down from above, or I disagree on like the person being subjugated. I was just like, is there a better term that I should be using then if these ones are off the table? I guess because I mean. You could say you disagree with the validity of my statement, but it's like, okay, well, even if you disagree, what word should I be using then? I think that's just what I was suggesting. I'm partially joking when I throw that out there, though. If there's anything that I'm taking away from this episode, it's that we've very much gone through a lot of the philosophical roots of where we disagree and why, and how we conceptualize both violence, force, and societies. And I think we might want to do something more narrow and actually talk about policies and policies incentives in the future. Because we've been talking about things that are very abstract, and it's easy to get kind of lost or bogged down. But we haven't talked about anything concrete in a while, so that might be something we want to explore in the near future. I think that's one of my takeaways, because I think we have done something similar to this episode a handful of times. Okay, is there anything else you want to add on this before we sign off?
Not about this point. I guess I would just reiterate something. Well, I'll say two things quickly, then you can wrap it up. I think I am quite proud of, or quite content with our ability to have these tough discussions. That's not something that everybody can do, or at least every two people or every group of people can do. And so I would just encourage anybody listening, both to, keep on listening for that very reason, but also I hope that we kind of can set an example, or we can, I'm not trying to put us on a pedestal and say we're better than everyone else or we're wiser, but I would hope that maybe if someone's listening to this, they might be able to help them be able to have these difficult conversations with people that they aren't in ideological agreement with. And then the other thing I just want to quickly add was a well-known commentator, left-wing commentator, passed away recently. His name was Michael Brooks. And I just wanted to quickly send condolences to his friends, to his family. I hadn't watched a lot of his content, but I've seen some of it, and I was generally impressed with it. So I'm sorry that the commentary community has suffered that loss, and I hope that his friends and family are able to cope with it as best as they can. And of course, he will be remembered by the many videos on the internet that he uploaded. So.
See, I was going to double down on us gloating about how great we are for taking our paradigms and crashing them into each other at full speed, and how we walk into hour-long conversations knowing we're just gonna disagree on stuff, and then we do it anyways just because we're masochists like that. But you took it to that somber note, and obviously I also give my condolences. Although I was not as familiar with his work, but I heard a lot about him in the recent days. So he does sound like an interesting figure. But on that note, I hope you guys stuck it through this episode. I know at the beginning it was slow, but we did get somewhere at some point. Once we were really able to repeat our arguments like 3 times each, we were able to kind of really point down some narrow things and at least clarify things, even if we didn't necessarily make progress. But sometimes that is progress in and of itself. In the future, hopefully we'll focus on something more narrow, so we can maybe have a more thoughtful disagreement instead of getting bogged down in like me talking about abstract examples that are always hard to follow. But if you guys enjoyed this episode, you could see the video version on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points, and then you could see our lovely faces and how angry both of us look when we're muted and the other person's saying something and continuing to pontificate for like 2 more minutes. And it's like, oh my God, I'm so angry. I already forgot my point. You'll see all those expressions if you watch the video version. If not, you can find us on audio on all the podcatchers like Stitcher, Apple, or Spotify. And we'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for listening. Signing off, it's Mad Matt.